I'll be discussing the ways in which slavery represented racism in the United States. This decorative printing of the Emancipation Proclamation illustrates the horrors of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, during the American Civil War. It declared the freedom of slaves in 10 states that were still fighting. This meant 3 of the 4 million slaves in the US were to be freed. The proclamation was based on Lincoln's constitutional authority. It was not a law passed by Congress. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the fighting states are, and henceforward shall be free. However, the Emancipation Proclamation was limited in many ways. It applied to only the states who had left the Union, leaving slavery to continue in the loyal states. The proclamation didn't outlaw slavery and did not make ex-slave citizens. All this, however, depended on the Union military victory. This painting by Francis Bickenwell Carpenter shows Abraham Lincoln publicly reading the Emancipation Proclamation for the first time. Though the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves, it was what it represented that was important. It changed the idea of the war by capturing the minds of millions of Americans and made the war about fighting for human freedom rather than saving the nation. The proclamation accepted black men into the Union Army, allowing these men who had been slaves and victims of racism to fight for their rights as equal humans. This resulted in almost 200,000 black soldiers fighting for the Union and their freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation was one of the first steps to outlawing slavery and giving blacks and ex-slaves full citizenship. This shows how blacks were treated unequally and were used as slaves just because they were a different race. The Emancipation Proclamation shows the length individuals had to go to stop the slavery and unjust racism towards the blacks in the US. Though many disliked the idea of black slaves being free, Abraham Lincoln persisted with the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, "You dislike the Emancipation Proclamation and perhaps would have it retracted. You say it is unconstitutional. I think different." The 14th Amendment is a post-Civil War amendment and is seen as one of the most significant changes to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is a clear example of the racism that went on in the US. It provides a definition of US citizenship, overturning the original Dred Scott definition, which excluded African Americans. The amendment requires all US states to provide equal protection under the law to all persons, blacks and whites. The amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the US. This included former slaves who had recently been freed. The basic goal of the 14th Amendment was to protect the civil rights of all Americans, regardless of their race and gender. It also limited the power of states by some extent. It said, "No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The idea was proposed on June 13, 1866 by Congress and made official by the states in 1868. The 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says that the government in the U.S. may not prevent citizens from voting based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude, meaning his past slavery. It became official on February 3, 1876. Both these amendments recognized racism in the U.S., as before they were ratified, African Americans weren't treated fairly and didn't have the same rights as white people, even though they had been freed as slaves. Both widened the boundaries of civil rights for all Americans. According to Supreme Court Justice Noah Swain, fairly constructed, these amendments may be said to rise to the dignity of a new Magna Carta. The slave trade that went on before the Civil War is an example of racism in the US. Slavery in America began when the first African slaves were brought up to the North American colonies in 1619 to help in the production of crops as tobacco. This image from the movie Django Unchained shows the brutal mistreating that slaves went through. European settlers in North America turned to African slaves as cheaper labour sources than servants. The first slaves came in a Dutch ship with 20 Africans. This idea of cheap labour spread through the colonies, resulting in the importation of 6 to 7 million slaves in the 18th century. This idea of taking someone away from their family and life to be beaten and worked just for having a different colour of skin is a clear example of racism in the US. Slaves in the South made up 1/3 of the population. The owners wanted to make slaves dependent on them, not allowing them to learn to read and write, and punishing them for rebelling. Slaves lived in brutal, cramped conditions and suffered a variety of sicknesses, such as blindness and respiratory diseases. To put a man through all this just because of the colour of his skin is a sickening epitome of racism in the US. This image from the 2013 movie 12 Years a Slave shows what happened when the slaves fought back against their owners. This racism was recognised by William Wilberforce, a politician and supporter of abolishing the slave trade. He said that such a system should so long have been suffered to exist in any part of the British Empire will seem to our posterity almost incredible. The concept of white supremacy is what began slavery, started the Civil War, and everything after. Its definition follows closely with that of racism and is countlessly apparent during the Civil War era due to the whites believing they were above the blacks and treating them like crap just for having a different coloured skin. All these factors link closely to slavery's representation of racism in the US.